Hi guys, today I'm going to show you how to build a network virtual appliance using pfSense for Azure. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the idea of a network virtual appliance, it's basically bring your own firewall to Azure. Now, it runs on a virtual machine, so there are plenty of other options out there that do very much the same thing. If you wanted to use like Fortinet or Palo Alto, you can get options from the Azure Marketplace and install those as appliances in your virtual networks on Azure. However, you might want to bring your own, and you can do this with a lot of different open source firewalls. I've done videos on other firewalls such as Untangle and IPCOP in the past, but I wanted to do one on pfSense. Now, you can get pfSense from the marketplace as well, and there are offerings for that, but I want to show you how you can do this in your own context. You can build the virtual machine yourself and deploy it to Azure without having to pay any licensing fees. So you can use pretty much the same way you'd use it on-prem, but you can use it in the Azure context as well. So I'm going to show you how to build the virtual machine first using a local instance on Hyper-V. Then I'm going to show you how to import that into Azure and then also configure Azure so that you can use pfSense Azure Network Virtual Appliance on Azure. So before we get too far in the weeds on this, I wanted to give you this diagram to show you kind of what we're going for. Now, there is a lot more complexity to networks than what this is representing, but this gives you the idea of what we're actually trying to build out. And this is typical of a network configuration where you have a device that is sitting between a front-end network and a back-end network. Well, on Azure, we can't really have a virtual machine attached to two virtual networks, so we have to do that with subnets. And what we can do with this is have a front-end subnet and a back-end subnet. The front-end subnet is basically where all of my internet connected devices will attach to, such as pfSense. And I have a back-end subnet is where all of my client devices or really my backend servers might connect to. And in between those, I put pfSense. Now, pfSense would connect to the front end and the back end with two different NIC cards. And I would have two different IP CIDR blocks for each of those networks. And I would put it between these, maybe an NSG to prevent outbound traffic from connecting to the internet directly. And I would also do user-defined routes or UDRs to ensure that all of my virtual machines and other workloads behind pfSense are actually going to go out through pfSense. So all of those different pieces will come into play as we build this out. But first, let's go figure out how to build this virtual machine using Hyper-V. So I'm going to start with the assumption that you already have Hyper-V installed. That's fairly easy to do. You just install it using the programs and features on your machine. You might have to enable something in your BIOS if you don't have virtualization enabled. But we're going to start with that assumption, and we're going to just basically start by creating a new virtual machine on this thing. So we're going to walk through the wizard. We're going to give it a name. We're going to call it pfSense AZ just for a good Azure name. And then we're going to use generation 2 for the hardware. We're going to give it a gig of memory. This is not only used for installation. That will be selected later whenever we actually choose something on Azure for the VM size. And we're going to need an internet connection for this to work. So I'm going to connect this to an external vSwitch, virtual switch. I have several defined here, but external is the one that will connect it to the outside world. And then for the disk, I'm only going to need about an 8 gig disk. You can create larger disk or smaller disks depending on your need. If you're going to be doing logging, choose a larger disk. If you're not going to be doing a ton of logging, use a smaller disk. 8 gig should be fine for a lot of installations. And then we're going to just choose our ISO file here. I'm going to assume that you've already downloaded pfSense and you have the ISO file. So I'll put a link in the video description below where you can download that directly from a mirror, and you can get the ISO image and then have that ready to install. And we select that, and we're going to go through the summary. And this is going to create the VM. We're not going to power it up just yet. So we're going to go over here to the settings, and we're going to add in a couple of extra NICs. We need at least one other NIC for this to make sense. And this will matter whenever we actually go to set this up in a minute. So I'm going to add in a second NIC, and I'm going to put this on an internal network. I defined that already. It doesn't really have to be connected to anything because we're going to assign it once we get this machine booted up. But for now, we need at least these 2 NICs, and that's going to be the minimal that we need. But if you have other networks that you're going to be supporting, then you might want to add additional networks on this, and that additional network segments that you might be put into your pfSense firewall. So if you have like 3 or 4 different subnets that you're going to be connecting this to, you'll need at least 1 NIC for each one of those. So, but I'm going to go with a minimum of 2 here. And so let's go ahead and set that. And there's one other setting that we need to turn on here, and that is security. We're going to disable secure boot because it won't boot with that on. And you can set the number of processors down to something like 2 or whatever, None of these other settings are really important as of right now, but we're going to go with. So after we do all those changes, we're going to go to start, right click and start, and then we can just click on this little one icon down here that will give us the boot screen right here. And this should start the installation process. So we're going to accept the license, and then we're going to install pfSense, and then we're going to select a network configuration. So it's not real important to pay attention to a lot what's going on here. That'll come later, but we need to at least get a WAN interface so that it can reach out to the pfSense servers to download updates and that kind of thing. So we're going to choose HN0 for the wide area network. That matters because that's the wide area network that we selected when we built the VM settings. When we went through the wizard, we created HN0, and then we added a second NIC, which was HN1. And we're just going to choose that one for the wide area network, and then continue. And then for the LAN interface, we're going to choose HN1, and we can just proceed with the installation. Now this is going to assign some IP addresses. We're going to change those later. So just stick with those for now. And then this will be the settings for our network. And we're then going to verify that we have an internet connection, and this will continue to go through the installation process. Now, the next thing will be configuring the drive after we select install. We're going to choose Stripe with no redundancy. The redundancy is handled by Azure, so we don't really have to have redundant disks here. And we're going to just basically use the full disk, which was an 8 gig disk, and that was DA0. And then once it's done, we're going to then to select what version we're going to install. We're going to use 2.7.2, which is the current version, and then it's going to install pfSense. So this will download a bunch of stuff, and once this is done, we'll come back. This takes about 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how fast your internet connection is and your drive speed. So now that everything's done installing, we're going to reboot. So this will reboot back onto the installed media now. So this would be our drive that we're booting off of now instead of the installation media. So when this boots, there's some things that we're going to have to configure. So we're going to say no to VLANs, and we're going to choose our wide area network here, same one as we did before. So HN0 is going to be our wide area network, and that's going to be the one that we're going to use for our wide area network on Azure as well. So we need these to match. So HN1 is the one that we're going to put on the external NIC for Azure, and HN0 is the one that we're going to choose for our wide area network on Azure, and HN1 is going to be our backend that we're going to be using on Azure. So it doesn't require So now that it's booting, we're going to wait for this to come up, and we should get a configuration wizard here. So we're going to say no to VLANs because we don't use VLANs here. We are going then to choose our wide area network. This needs to be the same one that we're going to be using on Azure. So HN0 is the wide area network that we're using here on our local virtual machine. So that's the one that we're going to be using on Azure as well. So we're going to say HN0 for our wide area network, and that's going to be configured automatically. And now for our local network, we're going to use our LAN side, which is going to be HN1, and that's going to be the same as on Azure. And this is what it's going to give us as a readout. Our WAN is HN0, LAN is HN1, and we're going to commit to that. And it's going to configure these interfaces and then finish the boot process. And this will bring us up into the console, basically, that we would get if we were SSH into this box, but it's a local context that we can interact with. So we're going to have to reconfigure some of the options here whenever we get this thing loaded up, because the options here are not needed for Azure. So as soon as this boots up, we'll start configuring that stuff. So once you get the initial boot done after you've created the VM, you'll get some kind of IP scheme that looks like this, where you have a wide area network and a LAN. And what we want to do is log into the UI, because there's a couple of things that we want to set in the UI that will basically accelerate our installation on Azure. So the first thing let's do is go ahead and get a box that looks like that's behind it on the LAN side, and log into the pfSense admin portal. So that would be, you could do that at 192.168.1.1, and the default username is admin. The password is pfSense all lowercase, and you'll get something that looks like this. And you can walk through the wizard if you want to learn more. Yeah, sure. And it's going to give you primary DNS server. We're not going to mess with all this. You don't really need to. Our main thing that we want to do here is set the IP address for what we're going to be using on Azure and turn on the serial console. So to do that, to turn on the serial console, go to System and then go to Advanced, and then scroll down almost to the bottom and then turn on Serial Terminal, and then set the primary serial to Serial Console right there, and then save that. And that will save the serial terminal. And then the other thing you can do is go ahead and change the admin password to something that is going to be what you want to use on Azure. So I'm going to go ahead and set mine right here and save that. And now I've got that saved. And the other thing that we want to ensure that we have turned off is going to be DHCP server. We don't need DHCP server enabled for any of our boxes here. So we can go ahead and save that setting. And we're not going to apply that we can even go ahead and apply that one. That's fine. Make sure that DNS resolver is turned on. It should be turned on by default, but it's turned on here. So just double check that. So let's go ahead and last thing we want to do is set our IP address for our LAN. So I'm going to go ahead and choose LAN right here. And I'm going to make sure this is enabled, but then I'm going to use a static IP address right here. I'm going to set this to 10.0.1.4. And then we're going to save that. And once I hit apply, I won't be able to reconnect to this unless I change the IP scheme for this Windows 11 VM. So hit apply, and then it's just going to spin indefinitely. But then with that in mind, we can come over here and turn off this particular box here. So let's go ahead and turn off pfSense, and that will basically save those settings, and we're ready to upload this to Azure now. The first thing we need to do is convert this to a VHD, which is pretty straightforward. So we're going to, in the admin console here, we're going to go to edit disk, and then we're going to locate our disk to be the disk that we've been working on, which would be this pfSense AZ VHDX right here. We're going to open that up. For our action, we're going to choose convert, and then we're going to export it to a VHD. We're going to do a fixed size disk, and we're going to put it right there. So we can call it pfSense. And then we're going to name it basically the same thing, VHD, and we'll just put an AZ for good measure on that, and then hit finish and let that convert it. This doesn't take long. Basically just kind of pads the disk and then creates a copy of it. And so now everything is ready to go up to Azure. So we're going to run some Azure CLI commands to get this up into Azure. So now that everything is ready to go on the VM, I want to upload this to Azure. The first thing I want to do is get logged in and make sure that you have the Azure CLI already installed. I'm going to assume you've done that already. So if you want to create a resource group, you can do that. I've already created one called pfSense Azure RG. And this one will attempt to create it, but it will fail because I already have it. But you'll see me create a resource group that didn't create it. So provisioning state, it's that one actually already exists. But we're going to create a storage account in that resource group. And I already have one called this particular one right here. So I'm going to call it pfSense Azure SA1, and it's going to be in that resource group. And this should create with a success. And this can take a few seconds to do. Usually about 10 to 15 seconds to complete. And then once we're done with this, we're going to add in some container, and then we'll upload to that container. And then that will actually create a predictable URL that we can then use to create a virtual disk from. So that created the storage account. Next thing to do is actually upload to create the container in the blob storage portion of the storage account. So that looks like this. So Azure Storage Container Create VHDS, and then it's the name of that account that we just created. And this only takes a second to do. Now we're going to upload it, and this can take a minute to do depending on the speed of your internet connection. And we're going to upload that VHD that we just created. So pfSense AZ VHD, and we're going to point to that file. That's what it'll be named on the actual storage account. Now, depending on the speed of your internet connection, this can take a while. It can be very fast or very slow. It just depends on how fast your upload is. I have 500 megabits up. Yours might be better than mine. It might be worse, but just wait for this to finish. And when it's done, we'll convert this into a virtual hard disk on Azure. Okay, now that upload is finished, I am going to go ahead and create the virtual disk, which is actually really easy to do. It's just a command that we can run again on the Azure CLI. We're going to go az disk create, put it in the same resource group that we did, and then we're going to give it the name of the name of the disk. It's my pfSense Azure disk or whatever is what I called it here. You can name it whatever you want, but I'm just for consistency, I'll probably just call it that. And the source URI is going to be the storage account right here, the name of the storage account, the name of the container, and then the name of the image that you uploaded right here. So pfSense AZ VHD, and then -- OS type is Linux. So we need that so that it knows that this is indeed a boot drive and not just a data disk. So let's go ahead and create this, and that should create the resource. And this only takes a few seconds to do. And then we'll hop over to the Azure portal and start the work there. So I'm going to go ahead and create the virtual network that we're going to be using for this. It's pretty straightforward. So I'm going to create a virtual network right here. And there's a couple of things that we're going to do to this virtual network that I want you to kind of pay attention to, because this is going to be shape how this virtual network performs. So let's go ahead and search for virtual network on the marketplace, and we're going to choose virtual network here. And let's go through the wizard in the portal, and I'm going to put it into that pfSense Azure RG that we created, and then review and create. And I need to give it a virtual network name. I'm going to call it pfSense. Let's call it virtual VNet or something like that. And we're going to make sure that this is in the East US region. That's where I put everything else. So that's where I'm going to stick this particular resource here. Security, we're going to turn on Azure Bastion in just a second, but I'm going to configure the IP space first. So it's going to default to a 10.0.0/16, which is fine. This is going to be the external network. So I can call it external, or if I wanted to use the same terminology that pfSense is using, I can call it WAN. I think I'll just stick with that just for clarity's sake right here. And I want this particular one to be 10.0.0.0/24. And that all looks, the rest of this looks pretty much the way I want it to be. So I'm going to take that as my first subnet. Second subnet is going to be LAN, which is then a second subnet that I'm going to add here. And it's going to be in that same IP range, and it's going to have a start address of 10.0.0.1.0/24. So I'm going to use the same nomenclature that I was using in pfSense, just so for clarity's sake here. And I'm going to enable private subnet. So there's going to be no outbound traffic from this that it will allow. You'll need a NAT gateway or a virtual appliance for this to work. So I'm going to go ahead and add this one in, and we should see something that looks like this. Then I'm going to go back over here to the security tab, and I'm going to turn on Azure Bastion, because I'm going to use Azure Bastion to connect to a virtual machine so that I can actually test this thing out whenever, or configure it, whatever. So that's typically how you'd want to do this rather than expose an IP address. So let's go ahead and go to next and review and create. And it's going to run a validation on this. And let's go ahead and create this particular VNet. So now that we have the network configured, I'm going to go ahead and create a route table and also configure the DNS for this as well, because we'll need to have that ready to go. So in the marketplace, type in route table and search for that, and we should be able to get a route table. Go ahead and create one of these guys. And these things create pretty fast. So we're going to put it in the same region, call it pfSense route table, RT or something like that. Should be fine. If you are going to be using BGP like a VPN, this is something that you might want to turn on, propagate gateway routes. If not, you can turn it off. Either way, it's not a bad thing to have if you're going to be doing any kind of hybrid, cloud of some kind. So once this is done, let's go to the route table, and let's go ahead and create some routes here. We're going to add a default route, and it's going to just call it the default route. And this is going to basically take precedence over what we have already set by the system routes. So we're going to set it to the entire IPv4 space. So 40/0, next hop is going to be virtual appliance, and it's going to be the IP of our pfSense box. So 10.0.1.4, and add that. And that's going to add the route. Then we're going to add the subnet for that. We're going to associate this with our LAN subnet. And that will then tell everything on that LAN to use 10.0.1.4 as its default gateway, essentially the router for that network. So it should end up with something that looks like this when we're done. So the next thing to do is basically to configure the DNS for this. So let's go ahead and look at the DNS. The DNS is set on the virtual network itself. So we're going to go ahead down here to DNS and then set a custom DNS. And I'm also going to set that to the pfSense box. And so 10.0.1.4, and then all of the DNS queries will go to this. So for this to work, we're also going to have some other things that we're going to set in the DNS settings later on our pfSense box. But for now, that's all we need. And now we can get to creating a VM. Okay, now that we have our network created and our disk is uploaded, I think we're ready to create our virtual machine. So to do that, we're going to go into the disk that we uploaded, and we're going to create a VM from that disk. So this is pretty straightforward. We're just going to create a virtual machine on Azure, and I'm going to call this one pfSense VM, or whatever you want to call it. We don't need redundancy. ARMS is x64, and the size of it is really up to you depending on what the demand for your network is going to be. So if you have a lot of demand that needs a lot of CPU, choose a big VM. If you need faster NICs or whatever, I mean, there's a lot of variables that go into that depending on which options you choose in pfSense and how much traffic you have and so on. For this particular demo, I can get away with a small VM. So this V2 ATS V2, 2 CPUs, 1 gig should be fine for pfSense in this context. I'm not going to have it. There's going to be no public inbound ports. We're basically going to turn that off, and licensing type is other. The disk is going to be set automatically because I'm creating this from a disk. We're going to choose the wide area network for our subnet, and then that will assign a public IP address. We're going to not have a network security group for this, and we're not going to turn on any kind of load balancing or anything like that. So that's, I think, the only option on this that we need to set for anything beyond the basics. So management, we can take the defaults on all of this. And for monitoring, we can take the defaults on all of this. And there's really nothing in terms of extensions or tags that we need. So let's go ahead and create this virtual machine, and we will come back when it comes back up. So after the VM creates, go ahead and shut it down. I've already shut mine down, but go ahead and stop it because we're going to make some changes to the network here. So go to network settings, and we're going to attach another NIC to this for the LAN side, because the one that's already up is the wide area network, or the WAN side. So let's go ahead and attach a network interface here. We're going to create a network interface right here and put it in the same resource group and so on. Give it a name, pfSense, LAN NIC or something like that. And we're going to assign it to the LAN subnet. So 10.0.1.4. We're not going to put a network interface. We're going to assign a static IP to it. So 10.0.1.4 will be in that IP space. And then we're going to click create, and that will create the network interface. So once this creates, there's one more thing that we need to do to it. And that is to ensure that it can serve as a router. We're going to turn on the ability for the network to route traffic. So this is going to take a second for this to finish. And we're going to go down here to IP configuration, turn and click on enable IP forwarding and click apply. And then that will update the network settings for this guy. So once everything is done, you can just start up your VM. I already started mine, but once you are done with that, now you can add a virtual machine on the LAN side so that we can connect to that using Azure Bastion. So I'm going to do that offline and come back whenever I have that virtual machine ready to go. And we should be able to connect to pfSense and ultimately the internet through pfSense from that VM. So once you have that VM created, you should be able to connect to it by way of Bastion. That's why I created the Bastion host. So I guess that's the more proper way to do it. And I'm just going to log in by way of Bastion to this machine using the username and password that I had set up already. I've already logged into it once, so you should be able to connect to it right here. So let's see what we got here. I have a Windows 11 VM. Let's go ahead and launch the browser. And the browser on this particular machine is kind of slow because this is a pretty underpowered VM for Windows 11, but it's probably just fine for what I'm doing here. So let's go ahead and open up the admin panel for pfSense. If I'm connecting to it, that means I have at least some kind of connectivity. And you can see down here, I've got network connectivity to the internet. So you can see that I have internet access through pfSense here. So this is pfSense logged in. And if you want to change things here, you can definitely do that. One thing I would recommend doing is while you're here is going into the general setup and adding the magic DNS for Azure. The magic DNS for Azure is just an IP address that allows us to use the internal resolution. It's basically the forwarder for any DNS resolution that might happen. So all my VMs are going to go to pfSense. pfSense is going to either resolve it locally or forward it on to Azure for that reason. So it might be something worth setting there. You don't have to do it that way, but that would help with resolving names if you had other Azure services that you wanted to do and so on. Some other things that you might want to add would be firewall rules for internal stuff. So you can definitely set internal one-to-one NAT if you want to do that. Allow for that kind of stuff. You don't need DHCP because Azure's handling all that. You could install Bind9 if you want like a local administration for DNS records here. You can also turn on IPsec or OpenVPN if you wanted to have VPN access into that, into this particular box here. So there's a lot of things that you can do with this because it's a full-blown network virtual appliance. So just to show you that there's no smoke and mirrors here, let's go to google.com. Let's open up a tab here. This is going to be pretty painful considering that this VM is just not that great in terms of hardware. Let's go ahead and just pull up google.com and say, what is my IP? And just to ensure that this is indeed going through our pfSense box 40.76.28.196. And let's just make sure that is the external IP of our IP 40.76.28.196. And indeed it is. So all of my traffic is flowing through pfSense from this Azure VM. So that will give you everything you need to set this up. So I'll put the instructions for everything I did in the console in the video description down below, as far as what we did on the Azure CLI, and as well as any other kind of information that you might be interested in related to this. So hopefully you find this useful and you'll have a pfSense network virtual appliance running in your network in no time. If you like this content, please consider subscribing to the channel by clicking on the subscribe button. You can also like this content by clicking on the thumbs up or share this content with your friends, and also comment in the comment section down below. You can also find me online at www.blaze.net or on Twitter at @TheOneMule. And as always, thanks for watching.